visiting research fellow at MCC Brussels. This report I did, which looked at how the EU Commission is funding what I discovered 349 projects that allegedly are about hate speech and disinformation, but in fact are nothing more than projects that aim to control, to define by the Commission what it regards as hate speech and what it regards as disinformation. In other words, these are not projects that are genuine research projects, although they've funded them to the tune of almost 650 million euros, which in fact is 30% more than they spend on cancer research. And what that said to me was that they fear that more than they do a disease that kills over 2 million Europeans every year. What becomes clear when you read these projects is that this is not a campaign against disinformation, it's a campaign against dissent, because they decide that, for example, populist ideologies or populist parties that oppose, say, the Green Deal or current immigration policies, they now regard as disinformation or as fake news or whatever. So it's not about the truth, it's about them deciding what the truth is. So when it comes to hate speech, they're not trying to combat hate speech. What they're trying to combat is free speech, because they can decide, they again can determine what speech is acceptable or what's not. So for example, if you question gender ideology, if you question transgenderism, and you suggest that there are only two sexes, then this can be regarded as hate speech because there's a hate crime against transgender people. And so the report is very, very important in terms of firstly exposing how much taxpayers' money is being used in a way that's completely unaccountable. But secondly, and probably more importantly, it shows what a threat this is to democracy, because they are attempting to control the conversation. They are not allowing free speech because they fear free speech. What they fear above everything else is that ordinary people have the ability to decide for themselves. They're not asking genuine research questions because they know what the answer is before they begin. What they're doing is they're trying to confirm that that exists. So every one of these reports will have a sentence somewhere in the objectives that will say hate speech is a rising problem and disinformation is a threat to the future of social stability or democracy in Europe. They don't set out to question that assumption. They set out to prove that assumption. And so they find the evidence that this is the case, and they do everything they can to prove this. And then, of course, they end every report by saying, well, more research needs to be done, because hate speech and disinformation is hidden. It's difficult to discern. And, of course, the reason why it's difficult to find hate speech is because there's no clear definition of what hate speech is. You know, they decide what hate speech is. They decide what's disinformation. For the Commission, what's important about all of this is that it proves that they are right, that there is a problem of hate speech. So it legitimizes what they are doing. And it suggests to me that they have got a real problem. And the problem they've got is a legitimacy problem. So in other words, it's a position of weakness, in my opinion, that you have to spend that amount of money to convince not only yourself, but the world that this is a big problem. They actually think that ordinary people lack the political independence or the moral independence to decide for themselves what is true and what's false, to decide for themselves what they believe in. So they need to be told by these self-appointed and unaccountable commissioners, right? Because, you know, let's remember that. that they know what's best for the rest of us, because they have experts and they have, all these professionals who will tell you what we should be eating, what we should think, how we should bring up our children, etc. All these very important questions. They don't believe that we have the ability to do that. So they treat the electorate like infants. If you look at something like Fastlese, it's basically an attempt to educate young people into how they should be thinking about hate speech and disinformation. And what they claim to be doing, which is to involve young people in co-design and capacity building and all of this, is actually a process whereby they are inculcating, they're indoctrinating young people to think in a particular kind of way as to what hate speech is and what they need to do to counter it. They are not teaching young people to think critically. They're teaching young people to accept uncritically their view of the world. And they want to turn them into agents. They actually use that terminology, which basically means that the Commission is using young people, outsourcing censorship, because young people now will be vigilant and be looking on the internet for hate speech and flagging it up and warning everybody, etc. It's really it's disingenuous. It's very dishonest. So they're creating layers in society who are basically being re-educated to think like the Commission and not to think independently. And I think that's a big problem.
Thanks a lot.